And perhaps the most important thing Verdun gives us today is not numbers or the names of generals, but an understanding of the scale of the human cost when in politics, ambition, mistakes, and cold calculation turn into 10 months of continuous nightmare on a narrow strip of land. There, where one side wanted to bleed the other white, both ended up bleeding. There, where they wanted to demonstrate strength, the world saw above all senselessness. And that is why Verdun is the perfect symbol of the First World War, a war in which no one truly won, but everyone lost something forever. Imagine Europe in early 1916. The front has been standing still for a year and a half from the North Sea to the Swiss mountains. Millions of people live in trenches. The land has turned into scars. There are no quick victories, no beautiful cavalry maneuvers, only mud artillery fire and endless waiting. And then one man in the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, proposed an idea that sounds almost cynically brilliant. You don't need to break through the front. You don't need huge territorial gains. You just need to choose a place that is too important for France to ever give up. And then hit that place so long and so hard that the French army will bleed out trying to hold it at any cost. According to Falkenhayn himself, his goal was to bleed France white, to make sure she simply could no longer fight. That point became Verdun. By that time, Verdun was not just a dot on the map, it was a symbol, a fortress that had protected France since the Franco-Prussian War, a city covered by a ring of forts, concrete, steel, casemates, guns, depots. If Germany broke through here, it would be a blow not only to the front, but to the French psyche and to their historical memory. The paradox is that by 1915, the French themselves had already started to consider these forts outdated. The experience of the first months of the war showed that heavy German guns, 420 millimeters and similar, could easily smash concrete fortresses. The General Staff decided keeping large garrisons in them is dangerous and pointless. Some guns were removed, many forts were left with minimal maintenance personnel. Among them was the biggest and highest fort in the defensive ring, Fort Douaumont. That is how the ground was prepared for a future disaster. The Germans prepared for a blow almost pedantically. They chose a narrow arc of the front north of Verdun. They brought in hundreds of heavy and super heavy guns. Railways and depots worked like clockwork. Artillery positions were prepared and camouflaged. Infantry units trained in new assault tactics. The French knew something was coming. Intelligence had given warnings. But they did not fully understand the scale of the threat. Commander-in-Chief Joffre was sure the main German attack would come on another sector of the front. Verdun was important, but not decisive. Some artillery was pulled out, some troops were redeployed. As a result, the Verdun sector was not as strong as it could have been. On 21st February 1916 at 7:15 in the morning, German artillery opened fire. This was not just a barrage, it was a storm of metal. In the first days, the Germans fired millions of shells at French positions. Later estimates suggest that up to 70% of all casualties at Verdun on both sides were caused by artillery fire. The ground around the fortress literally began to boil. The forest turned into a field of uprooted stumps. Roads disappeared, trenches collapsed. Whole shelters with all the men inside were wiped off the face of the earth, and no one knew any more whether anyone there was alive. Soldiers later recalled the sky was no longer visible. There was only smoke, flashes, and a roar. It felt like the entire world had turned into one giant artillery blast. After this hellish preparation, German infantry went on the attack. In the first days, the defense was held mostly by second rate French units, territorial troops, formations that were not considered elite. They found themselves under a storm of such force that no one had been ready for it. The front was cracking. Villages north of Verdun, Ornes, Beaumont, Samognieux, Louvemont disappeared one after another. On the map, they still existed. On the ground, they were gone. These were not city battles as we imagine them now. It was more a fight over ruins, shell holes, and fragments of forest. Soldiers wrote home letters that often never arrived. We no longer recognize the world. There is only mud, fire, and screams. Every second it feels like this cannot be reality. On the third or fourth day, the Germans approached the main symbol, Fort Douaumont. And here the tragic irony of French decisions fully revealed itself. Fort Douaumont, once considered an impregnable stronghold, was practically empty by February 1916. Inside there was only a small maintenance garrison, a few dozen men, technicians, and a few artillerymen. The effective commander was a non-commissioned officer. There were almost no officers on site. The French High Command believed that the main fighting would take place in the forward field positions and the fort was a secondary element. On 25th February, a small group of German soldiers, about 90 men from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, crawled their way to the fort. Artillery had been pounding the area for days. The defenders were sitting in the lower levels, trying to ride out the bombardment. A German NCO with a small team found an entrance that was not properly secured. They slipped inside almost without firing a shot, moved through the corridors, and took the French garrison by surprise. One of the greatest forts in Europe was captured by a handful of soldiers, almost without a fight. For France, it was a shock. The news spread quickly. Douaumont has fallen. In the public eye, this was not just a military setback, it was almost a national humiliation. Verdun was no longer just a sector of the front. It was now a question of honor, survival, and symbolism. At this moment, a man stepped onto the stage whose name would forever be linked to Verdun, Philippe Pétain. He was appointed commander of the Verdun sector. He didn't arrive as a hero, but as an officer given an almost hopeless task: stabilize the front and prevent the collapse of Verdun. The first thing Pétain did was understand that without supply, everything else was pointless. By then, almost all the railways leading to Verdun were destroyed or under fire. There was only one main artery left, a road from the town of Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. This road would go down in history as the Sacred Way, Voie Sacrée. Along it, day and night, without stop, trucks carried ammunition, food, water, and reinforcements. In the first weeks, about 600 trucks a day were moving along that road, delivering hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of tons of shells and supplies. Later, the flow increased to the point that vehicles formed an almost continuous column, one truck every 14 to 25 seconds. Anyone who slowed down risked being pushed aside, not out of cruelty, but because the fate of an entire front depended on that flow. The road was constantly repaired, potholes were filled, stones were brought in. Every soldier heading to Verdun knew, if you're on this road, you're going into one of the deadliest battles of the war. Petain introduced a system of troop rotation. He understood that if the same units were kept under Verdun for months, they would collapse physically and psychologically. So, by his order, almost the entire French army passed through the Verdun cauldron at one time or another. Estimates suggest that up to 70% of soldiers who served in French units on the Western Front spent at least some time at Verdun. That turned the battle into a national experience. Verdun was no longer a battle somewhere out there. It was the place where your brother, your son, your neighbor, your teacher had been. At the same time, tactics changed. The French created deeper defense and abandoned the idea of holding every position to the last man at any cost. New lines and strong points were built, artillery coordinated more closely with infantry. Petain put the main emphasis on artillery fire. Artillery kills, infantry only occupies. In those days, a slogan was born that later became legendary. They shall not pass, ils ne passeront pas. Historians argue about who exactly coined the phrase, but it is most often associated with General Robert Nivelle, who would later replace Pétain at Verdun and become a symbol of a tough but effective offensive. This slogan became not just a phrase, but a vow. For France, this was a symbolic moment. The fortress, whose fall in February had been a national humiliation, was now retaken. Not only part of the defensive line was restored, but also a sense of self respect. In December 1916, French troops continued to advance, pushing the Germans further from Verdun. The 18th of December is usually considered the date when the main phase of the battle ended. The front stabilized again. The Germans never managed to take the city or destroy the French army, but the price of the status quo was horrifying. How much did Verdun cost? There are no exact figures. Historians disagree, but most estimates give numbers that chill the blood. Roughly 330,000 German casualties and more than 370,000 French casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. In total, over 700,000 men in 10 months of fighting, and yet the front hardly moved. By the end, both armies were standing roughly where they had stood at the beginning. German officer P.K. Etikoffer later wrote, with bitter irony, that Verdun was supposed to bleed France white, but Germany bled with her. From a purely military standpoint, one might call it a victory that France held. The city was not taken, the army was not destroyed, morale was not completely broken. But from a human standpoint, Verdun is an example of how, in the industrial age, war turns into a machine for grinding people into nothing. The consequences of Verdun went far beyond 1916. For France, it was a wound that would not heal for decades. A whole generation of men went through this hell. The memory of Verdun influenced French military doctrines, politics, and attitudes toward future wars. The experience of the meat grinder made the country extremely cautious, inclined to defensive strategies. This would partly lead to the construction of the Maginot Line and shape how France faced the Second World War. For Germany, Verdun became a symbol that even carefully planned, rational operations turned into uncontrollable slaughters. Falkenhayn lost his post as chief of the general staff. Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over and changed the course of operations. But by then, the country had already suffered such losses that any victory began to look hollow. For all of Europe, Verdun was a warning. A warning that, in an age of heavy artillery, mass armies, industrial shell production, and mechanized logistics, war ceases to be politics by other means in the old sense. It becomes a natural disaster that devours resources and people, no matter how cleverly it is calculated on paper. Today, if you go to Verdun, you see a strange landscape, a forest that looks ordinary at first, but if you look closely, the ground is covered with soft waves, as if it has been plowed by giant claws. Those are the traces of shell craters, overgrown with grass and trees. Under that soft greenery still lie shells, fragments, pieces of weapons, and sometimes soldiers' remains. On the battlefield stand memorials and ossuaries, where the bones of tens of thousands of unknown soldiers rest. Inside old forts like Douaumont, you can still find tunnels, casemates, and traces of fire and explosions. People walk there as if in a museum, but it is a museum that was once a kind of hell. It is no accident that Verdun is often called the battle that broke Europe. This is not only about physical destruction, it is about the fact that after such battles, old ideas about the world, war, and heroism never really come back. Before Verdun, you could still believe that the next war would not be short and decisive. After Verdun, it became clear if humanity did not change its approach, it would keep creating and launching the same kind of meat grinders again and again. But the spring and summer of 1916 at Verdun were not one continuous attack, but a series of blows and counter blows that merged into one long nightmare. The Germans increased pressure, striking different sectors in turn. First the right bank of the Meuse, then the left. Their goal was to push forward, seize the heights, capture additional forts such as Faux. Each of these sectors was like a small separate war. The French responded with counterattacks, trying to recapture lost ground. But it wasn't so much about meters of land as it was about the exhaustion of men. On both sides, soldiers lived in a world where the ground was literally carved up by shell craters. Bodies often couldn't be buried in many places. They lay in those same craters where the living took cover. Rain turned everything into sticky mud where men, horses, and wagons drowned. Artillery could start at any second without warning. One German soldier later wrote that for them this was no longer a battle you can win or lose. It was something else entirely, a thing they called the meat grinder, the Moloch, hell. Sometimes the front line shifted by a few hundred meters, sometimes only by a few dozen. But on the scale of the whole front, after months of fighting, both sides often ended up almost where they started. The price was hundreds of thousands of lives. At Verdun, the romanticism of war died. If in 1914 the word soldier for many was still linked to ideas of glory, uniforms, and parades under music, by mid 1916 it was clear. War in the modern era is first and foremost industrial slaughter. Artillery, like a factory, mass produced death. By some estimates, tens of millions of shells were fired at Verdun, and once again, the majority of casualties were caused by artillery, not bayonet charges or 19th century style engagements. Soldiers learned to live under this constant roar. They slept in underground shelters where the air was heavy and damp. They drank water mixed with mud and traces of powder. They often ate literally among wreckage and corpses. Many could not withstand the psychological strain. The term shell shock appeared, what we now call PTSD. Verdun became a laboratory of the horrors of the 20th century. By the summer of 1916, the situation slowly began to change. On the one hand, The Germans still held key positions, including Douaumont and other forts. On the other hand, their plan to bleed France white was backfiring. First, French artillery had grown stronger and more experienced. Second, on another sector of the front, the Allies launched a massive offensive, the Somme. This forced the German command to shift some reserve equipment and attention away from Verdun. Verdun, from being the main bet, gradually turned into one more center of exhaustion that no longer delivered the political result Berlin had hoped for, but continued to consume men and shells. Inside Verdun itself, events continued to show the senselessness of what was happening. One of the most terrifying examples was an explosion inside Douaumont in May 1916, when a fire caused by careless handling of flames and ammunition set off a huge detonation, killing hundreds of German soldiers inside. The fort that was supposed to protect men became their mass grave. By autumn, the initiative had definitively passed to the French. By then, Pétain had been assigned to other posts, and Verdun was now under the command of that same Nivelle. His mission was not just to hold on, but to take back the key positions. French artillery prepared a revenge. Super heavy guns were brought in, including 400 millimeter railway guns with symbolic names like Alsace and Lorraine. They pounded Douaumont and other forts, destroying whatever could still be destroyed. On 24th October 1916, French forces launched an offensive. The Germans were no longer what they had been earlier in the year, exhausted, depleted, lacking fresh reserves. After a powerful barrage, French infantry moved forward, and soon Fort Douaumont was back in French hands